Without further ado, Protecting Windows Credentials, an excessive guide for security professionals by Mark Burnett.
Thanks. Okay, this is right here. This is the URL, by the way, if you want to leave comments or whatever on the pair list page, I guess, for this talk. Hang on a second here. All right, is that better? Can you hear me? All right, well, I'm Mark Burnett, and I've been doing security for about 20 years or so. Security. I've been doing security for about 18 years, and then security for about 2 years before that. But one of the things, I mean, I've worked in just about every area of security, but one of the main things I've been doing a lot over the years is Windows, and I also like doing password stuff. So this is Windows and password stuff. But okay, so now hardening Windows is a huge project, and so I'm trying to limit the scope on this as much as I could. Basically, what I was thinking here is, those of us who are security professionals, you get just really tired of users sometimes. I mean, you're telling them the same things over and over and over and over again, and you're trying to secure them, and they're still getting hacked. So this talk is about screw them. Let's just get ourselves secure for now. Let's just talk about how we get ourselves, how we can do stuff that we normally wouldn't recommend for other users, but it's kind of good stuff for us, and let's get ourselves where make sure we're doing the right stuff on our own systems, because it's too easy to neglect that. And so the scope of this is kind of a standalone computer, or something that you do connect to a domain sometimes, but that you manage, that you keep to your, that you have admin access to, and that you're in control of, but you still use it with other resources, and you still, you may connect to other networks and stuff. But what this isn't, I'm not really going to log into Active Directory. I'm not going to Kerberos, passing the hash type stuff, and, things that are kind of way beyond the scope of this and way too long. This is already going to be, I already had to trim this back a ton just to fit in 16 minutes. And it's definitely not for regular users. It's, a lot of the stuff that, it's just going to annoy them. You don't really want to, I mean, these aren't typically things that you would have normal people do, but, I mean, the thought is that security professionals do have a higher threat profile, and, some people more than others, of course, but, all of us are targets, and all of us, could potentially be, a jumping point for other attacks. And it's kind of funny, but one of the reasons why you target the security people, because their security is so bad on their own systems. But let's see here. So Windows, I mean, it really has a bad reputation as just being really insecure. I mean, it's just been one thing after another, and a lot of it is just the way it was built from the beginning. The architecture has limited what they can do. They over the years, they've tried not to make too many extreme changes to what, how the kernel works, and they're building on broken protocols that they're trying to remain compatibility with. Storing credentials in memory, or storing hashes in memory, not properly securing the hashes, not properly hashing the hashes. So it's just a leaky bucket inside a leaky bucket is an analogy I like to use. I mean, we talk about defense in depth, but defense in depth doesn't really work if you're putting leaky buckets inside leaky buckets. And one of the things, I had this when I bought my house about 10 years ago. I thought it was really cool. I was having a lot of kidney stones at the time, and I found out that hard exercise helped me, endorphins and stuff helped the pain. So I decided I was going to dig a pond, by hand. And so I spent about a month or two doing that. And then I went to go seal the pond. And I think you see these ponds. I mean, they have water in them, and they don't, they're always full. So I was thinking, yeah, you got to seal it, but it's, the water just stays in there. But it turns out the water doesn't just stay in there. I mean, just the smallest little hole, and it'll be empty before you know it. And so what I would do, my wife found a bunch of pond line or a yard cell, and so I try to use all these little pieces and try to fit it into my pond. And what I ended up with is a lot of my thought was, okay, I put this one layer, it's kind of weak and it's kind of got holes in it, but I put another layer on top of it that was also kind of weak and had holes on it, and I just kind of did that. I figure if I have enough layers, eventually there's not going to be enough, any way to get in, but water finds a way. So that was my leaky bucket inside a leaky bucket, and I'd fill it up, and it would go back a few days later, and it would be completely empty again. And I had to just go, and I finally learned what you do is you get one layer, completely seal it, and then you get the next layer, completely seal that. And when you do have leaks in one layer, the next layer is a complete layer that will contain that leak. However, with Windows, you can't do that. You just got leaky buckets, so you're just kind of stuck. Things are changing with Windows. Windows 10 has made a number of improvements in the architecture, but in the meantime, there's a number of things that we're going to have to do ourselves to secure ourselves. Does anyone want me to cover this stuff here? Seems kind of boring. Okay, let me just do a quick overview. I just feel like everyone's already nodding off. It's only been like 5 minutes. Okay, so Windows is based on SIDS, which is a security ID, which is assigned to each user. DACLs, which are, you have there. I've gone on way too little sleep, and I've got way too much caffeine going through me right now. So if I start shaking and stuff, just yell out the answer for me. Access control lists contain DACLs and they contain SACLs. DACLs are discretionary access controls that control the permissions of who can access whatever object that is. The SACL controls the auditing and mandatory access or mandatory integrity control of the whatever object it's securing. There's privileges, so that and that's very similar to Linux or any other operating system. There's privileges for when you need to do something that's normally a protected action, like doing a backup or whatever. Privileges are a way for the system to assign that to specific users to take care of that task. Mandatory access control, that's supposed to be mandatory integrity control, but it's kind of similar to mandatory access control, but not quite. That's where you have different levels of elevation, I guess, where you have low, you have medium, you have high, you have protected, and system, and I don't remember all of them, but that's what you get when you do some kind of admin thing and the UAC prompt comes up and it asks for your permission. Whenever you go up, it has to prompt you for the permission to elevate that process. You can always write down to a lower level, you can read down to a lower level, you can execute down, but you can't read, write, or execute up. And then tokens and objects. Token is a security. I mean, it's once you've authenticated, the user is assigned a token, and the token contains a number of things. The user contains an object. The user is an object, and it contains a token. It contains a number of information, a number of bits of information. Bits of information about the privileges and forget that. You guys get it. Okay, let's talk about the architecture. Okay. When you have most operating systems have different rings of privilege, and that's basically what you can do on the system. Ring 0 is the most privileged process ring. It's enforced by the CPU, the different protection rings. Ring 0 is where the kernel exists, and that's where all the protected processes, the device drivers, hardware abstraction layer, anything that deals with the system itself. It's a shared memory area, so anything that exists in Ring 0, anything that runs in Ring 0 basically has full control of everything. And Ring 0 can communicate outside to other rings. It's just like with the mandatory integrity control. You can go one way, but you can't go the other way. So Ring 0 is the core of the system. It's the most privileged and the most protected and the most dangerous, really, part of the system. Oh, wait a second. Oh, there we go. Ring 3, we'll go from 0 to 3. 1 and 2 usually don't use. Ring 3 is where you have the subsystems, the basic core stuff. They call it user mode, and that's the core operating system stuff, the services, any user processes. Those all exist in Ring 3. Again, they can't communicate down to Ring 0, but it does need to have Ring 3 needs to do things that only Ring 0 is able to do. NTDLL provides the APIs for communicating to Ring 0 from Ring 3. So, without going too much into that, it's kind of a separation of user mode processes and protected kernel processes. And then in the, I think the screen's warped here. In the when you log into a Windows system, you establish a session, and there's the initial session is the system. That's session 0, and then any session after that would be session 1, 2, 3. So if you log in, first user logging in, you're going to be session 1, and then you have win stations. A win station is an object that it's a viewport, basically. It's the desktop. You have one win station 0 that you see. There are other win stations, but none of them are visible to the user. A win station can have one or more desktops. Now, a desktop is like with Windows, we have several desktops. We have our desktop that we see, and then we have the desktop, which is the login screen. Okay, that's its own desktop, and there's the screensaver, which is another desktop. Another desktop is when you do Control-Alt-Delete, and it comes up with a prompt, and the background dims. What that is, that's actually executing on a separate desktop. It takes a screenshot and dims it and shows that on a separate desktop. Now, the desktop, the different desktops that exist are isolated from each other, so they can't really communicate with each other from a user mode perspective. Now, with the kernel mode, anything communicate. The kernel has access to anything, so that's kind of the exception. And then on your desktop, you have multiple processes. Some of them may have windows that display. Some of them are background processes. And these processes can communicate with each other. They can send Windows messages to each other. They can hook each other's events and things like that, as long as they are the same user. Now, as long as they have the same security token access, and as long as they have the same mandatory integrity control access. So we've got all these different layers and different objects, and each of them provides a little bit of isolation for stuff, but none of them is really completely isolated. So, for example, you have a session. The kernel obviously has access to everything. You have win stations. You may have multiple users logging in, so you have multiple sessions, multiple win stations. You have desktops, multiple desktops. Now the desktops are isolated, so they're isolated on the user interface level, so they can't hook into each other's functions. They can't. It's a container that has its own processes. But it can't communicate with the other containers, and they can't hook each other's. They can't have access to each other's user interface, so they can't send Windows messages across different processes in different desktops. Within the same one, however, you can do that, and that's how keyloggers work, is that they hook the key press events in one window, and then they log all those key press events. However, on a secure desktop, it can't hook those. So that's why when you do that's why you have to do Control-Delete to log in. So you're in a secure desktop that's isolated from other desktops, and so you're safe, and you know that there are no keyloggers running in that process. And then there are also, well, let's bring this up. So these are some of the different ways that Windows can isolate stuff. You've got the security token, which I already talked about. Now you can have different processes running, like you can have a bunch of windows open under your username, under your login, but then you can open up a command prompt as another user. So you have, even though you're on the same desktop, you have different user processes. Now they are actually still, even though it's a different user, they're still in the same session, they're still in the same WinStation, same desktop, but they have different security tokens associated with that process. And the ACL, of course, is different as well. The ACL will, you can set, every object in Windows has an ACL, and you can set permissions on it, and a lot of people don't realize how many different permissions you can set. But like on a running process, there's no really good, easy way to set that in Windows, but a running process has an ACL. And so you can say this running process doesn't have permission to shut down, or this process doesn't have permissions to launch another process. So the ACL controls how the different processes can interact. The mandatory integrity control, like I said before, it prevents escalation from low integrity to high integrity. You've got app containers, which is the Windows Store apps, where they're and it's really a sandbox that has low integrity and has limited permissions on the system, limited number of API calls available to it. You've got a thing called UIPI, which is user interface. UIPI, which what it does is it prevents certain windows from interacting with each other. What it does, it limits certain messages that you can send or intercept from other windows, so it prevents things like shadow attacks, which is kind of an old thing we don't really hear about much anymore. Now you have jobs, which aren't really shown on here, but a jobs is a container of processes, and a job itself can have its own ACL. You've got containers, which would be like Docker or something like that. Sandbox apps, there's Sandboxy, there's a few of them, but Sandboxy is the main one people use, and that lets you run. It basically virtualizes the file system access, the registry access, and things like that, where it can block the network access, and so it's you can break out of them, but it is kind of nice for limiting access to different things. I mean, it's one layer. It's not comprehensive. Like anything that's kernel mode, for example, can break out almost all these things. Virtual machines, protected processes. Now, protected processes are a process that belongs to a system that that an unprivileged process can't access, and an unprivileged process can't terminate. If you try to terminate, if you elevate as administrator and you try to terminate it, the system crashes. Silos are a new thing that Microsoft still hasn't really completely deployed yet, but they're kind of enhanced containers. So you have this isolation. You have the isolation between processes, window messages, but it's nothing really is getting you there. But again, we need all this stuff because we're dealing with leaky buckets inside leaky buckets, and so that's the best we can really hope for. is hopefully that we're just making it hard enough until we get to the point where Windows is actually secure. Now, this is some of the things that they do. They're doing, and they started this with Windows 10. I talked about the kernel as the lowest level, but it really isn't the lowest level. There's actually, what they've done is made a hypervisor, which is ring -1, it's still ring 0, but they call it ring -1. And the hypervisor is actually below the OS. So when you run Windows, you're actually loading the hypervisor, and the hypervisor is loading the kernel and the user mode processes. So this is actually below the kernel. And the cool thing about it is the kernel can't access anything in the hypervisor, but the hypervisor can manage everything for the kernel. And there's just no way to get to well, I shouldn't say there's no way. It's unbreakable. There's no way, I said it again. It's really hard to get into the hypervisor. There have been exploits that have accessed that. But the cool thing, what's that? Oh, the hypervisor is small. I mean, it's a tiny amount of code, and so it makes it easier to audit and make sure that, it's not like the kernel, which is huge. And a massive attack surface. The hypervisor is a limited number of functions, limited amount of code, and it's running it basically controlled by the hardware itself. You see the VTX, I keep trying to think of the AMD one, but the features in the chipset that control that manage access to the hypervisor. So since we have a hypervisor that's below the regular kernel, what they've done is they created another kernel. And this kernel, it's not a true kernel. I mean, it's not a whole kernel. It's not a duplicate of all the code. But what it is kind of like a proxy kernel. So they took anything that's really sensitive, like crypto functions, are in the secure kernel. Everything else is available to that kernel, but it's just proxied over to the. There, it's proxied over to the main kernel, the insecure kernel. So it sends the calls over there. What this does is it keeps it isolated from the other kernel, and it has a limited amount of code, makes it a lower attack surface, makes it easier to audit. But the nice thing is they can't communicate with each other directly. It's all marshaled through the hypervisor. So you have this separation that you really could never accomplish before in Windows, where you can actually have code running in a secure kernel that's not accessible from this kernel. So if someone writes a driver, or they gain system access and they're able to install malware and stuff from this kernel, they're still not able to gain access to all the functions in here. And what we've got over here is that Microsoft has implemented a number of things like device guard, or credential guard, or a bunch of other guards. You guys, come on, what are the other guards? Patch guard, let's see. Anyway, a bunch of other guards that exist right here. And so one thing they do is they store the hashes for like your Kerberos hash and your NTLM hash for network authentication is stored in this secure user process area. When this kernel needs to access it, it sends a message to the secure kernel. The secure kernel does whatever crypto is necessary to deal with the hash, or to create the hash, or to or to validate the hash. So we've got this isolation that we've never had before. Now, right now, that's only available to Microsoft stuff. So you can't sign anything and have it run in there. It has to be signed by Microsoft, and it can only be Microsoft. So it's kind of a kind of cool thing and really secure, but we don't have access to it. But we do have. For now, we have Credential Guard that protects our credentials in that area. However, it doesn't protect all the credentials. It doesn't protect local logins. It doesn't protect all the Kerberos tickets. It doesn't protect stuff when you first log in and before it sends it over to the secure kernel. So there are limitations on how much it's protecting us, but hey, we're getting there. And they've got some really cool stuff coming up that does handle that. Now it handles more stuff, and it's they're expanding this constantly. But this is like the first major advancement in how Windows is handling the credentials in memory, and so it creates a true isolation from the regular kernel. Now the hypervisor, we talk about -1 here. The hypervisor, for this to for the whole thing to work, we have to trust that hypervisor. In order to trust the hypervisor, you have to have a TPM installed. And the TPM validates the hypervisor code when it loads, and then the hypervisor validates the kernel code, and then it loads it that way. So when you want to prevent someone from stealing your credentials, since we can't really do it right now in Windows, what we do is we just make it hard. So when I do on my pond, what I did is I ended up spray foam. I mean, isn't that stuff great? People talk about WD-40 and duct tape. I think it's spray foam and heat shrink tubing are what we really need in life. But I got me a whole bunch of cans of spray foam, like way too many cans of spray foam, and I would try to seal all these leaks, and I kind of got it working. It got to the point where it would take a month or so to completely drain out, but I got it long enough so I felt good about it. I actually ended up filling my pond up with gravel and plants. Because it got too much of it. But that's not the point. The point is, if you want to, just ditch Windows and deal with gravel and plants. Become a landscaper. So we increase the cost. We make it so it's harder to do, it takes longer to do, and in the process, they're creating more log entries, they're creating more noise, more things that we can catch. We can mitigate exploits, so we can prevent certain things from running, and we can block certain types of attacks. And Windows is getting a lot of exploit mitigations built in. They've got the Emmet, which is going to be completely integrated in the next version of Windows, the fall update. Then we've got reducing the attack surface. Now this is the thing about Windows. I mean, I don't know if you guys saw when I was doing this, and I hit the start menu accidentally. I had this really cool setup here, and I entered my password. When I set this up, I entered the password wrong, and then I verified it wrong. And then when I got here, I didn't know my password, and so I had to reinstall, and all I had was a Windows 10 Home. So you got this stuff, and so what I do is I reduce the attack surface before I even load Windows, before I even install Windows. And there's tools like NT-Lite or Nlite, or there's a number of them. Or you can use the DISM tool. You can there's a number of GUIs for that, and you can script however you want to, what components you want to remove. And so I pull out things like Cortana, I pull out telemetry, I pull out all these DLLs, and you can go through and using DISM, but it's easier to use the GUI tools like NT-Lite, where you just have checkboxes of what you want to remove. So you take all this stuff out, and you can get it like a 4 gig install, and narrow. Yeah, it's about 4 gig, isn't it? Yeah, and narrow down to like 2 gigs to install the whole, installation CD for Windows. And then you take out a lot of stuff like the pre-installed apps, all that stuff that popped up, Candy Crush. You take out what else is there that we don't like? Oh, and you put the original Windows calculator, put that back in, and the old one, the Windows 7 one, and you put in the old Windows 7 photo viewer, because new photo viewers, like I always hated that one, and I always hated the calculator. I mean, who wants this anyway? And so you can do all these cool things. You can add in your registry hacks or whatever you want to do in this at that point. And so you have a build that's already has the attack surface reduced. Of course, you get in there and then you run an update, and Microsoft puts half the stuff back. Here, can you zoom the camera in on me for a second? Stop doing that, Microsoft. They didn't zoom it in. I was just saying there's not even anyone standing by. But it looked cool, right? So that's the way you reduce attack surface. And this is really I talked about extreme. I'm not really able to get into a lot of the extreme stuff in the time I'm given here. I was originally going to do, give you all the stuff that I do, the list of registry settings and everything, but it'd been an hour worth of registry settings, would have been pretty boring. I still wouldn't have covered it all. So I'm kind of going on a higher level here, but you reduce that attack surface, and the main way you can do that is to not have it in there in the first place. And then when it's not in there, it's less likely that Windows will. They're getting it better, but with the last update, they didn't put as much stuff back, except for that 3D builder or whatever thing. You can't get rid of that. And then you want to contain the attack, so you want to make it so it's harder for them to expand from where they were at. How are we doing on time? What's the time? Okay. Attack process. So if you're going to attack Windows, you got to deliver the exploit somehow, either through a download or a 0-day or open port or something like that. You have to run the exploit. You run the code they run the payload, and then you've got to elevate usually, so you can actually do interesting stuff on the system. Now the hard thing about it is each one of these steps gets more and more difficult, and then beyond here you've got lateral movement and just pretty much owning you. But each step is harder and harder to contain. Once they've gotten to that one point, they can always keep moving forward. So that's why, like, when your company says, "Oh yeah, we were hacked in Yahoo, and we found the problem and we cleaned it up, so it's all good." But the fact is, it's not good. They haven't gotten rid of the problem because the person is probably already here and there, and so it gets way, way, way more difficult to roll that back, much less contain it. So what we want to do is we want to focus on containing at this point. We want to look at the choke points where we have to do the least amount of work and prevent us from getting to those prevent them from getting farther along. So what I do is I look at Windows as kind of a zero trust environment. We talk about zero trust networks, but who does trust Windows really anymore? Oh, come on, don't all raise your hands. And you really don't. I mean, they hide stuff from us administrators, and they obfuscate what certain processes do, and you see connections going. I remember I used to remember the modem light flashing. It's like, oh crap, someone's connecting. Something's going on, and you get panicked. Now it's just constant. Windows is constantly. Did everyone get that? See, when you have a modem and did anyone? Am I that old? Jeez. Hey, you remember when we had a modem and? We're the only old guys around here. Yeah, there's an old guy right here too. They're old.
I'm back to BBS.
BBS, yeah, and you connect there, and you saw the light going on. It's like you had to worry about something because the light was on, and now it's just constant. Any other old guys in here? Anyway, it's constant communication.
Wait a minute. I'm not even old enough to vote, for Christ's sake. What the hell are you talking about me?
I was just thinking of someone as old as me.
Just remember that whenever you point, there's three other fingers.
That's what I'm saying. I'm looking for someone as old as me. I'm talking about modems here. Come on. Yeah. Sorry if I offended you.
Yeah. I'm your goddamn stooge, is what you.
Can you come up here? Can everyone move around and let them up here? I've got a few other things to.
Is this Laurel and Hardy or what?
Yeah, that's right. So everything's the perimeter really now because you don't trust anything. You don't. I mean, Windows, Microsoft made it easy for a lot of other apps to have access to telemetry features, and I was on Twitter the other day.
Just a minute.
Yes.
As your student, I got this goddamn gray hair installing, Windows 98. How the hell am I going to understand what you're talking about?
I got a kidney stone installing Windows 98. It's amazing how it'll.
I'm still passing it. Jesus Christ. No,
Right now?
not just yet.
you have any other comments?
You need him.
What's that?
You need him right now.
Yeah. So we focus on checkpoints. Everything's perimeter. Yeah. So that's what we. Okay. So internet clients. The biggest way this stuff's getting into our systems. You got to keep it updated. I mean, this. Okay. I'm gonna. This. I kind of had a plan for here, but I have a feeling it's just going to end up with a big rant. And we're just going to go way over. But I shouldn't even be saying this stuff, half the stuff, but I'm saying it, so you have to keep your systems updated. There's sandboxes and containers. A lot of the browsers, Chrome is doing it, Edge is doing it, Firefox is getting there, where they have their own sandboxing mechanisms built in. There's a number of plugins that you can use to disable features and scripting. Stronger permissions. Now, one thing I do is with the default permissions, you're still tremendously exposed. And so the thing is, we want to control the system. We want to be in charge. We want to make sure that, we're the experts here, right? So we want to make sure it's only doing what we want it to do. So one of the things I do is look at, I look at this path of how I'm downloading files. You've got the downloads directory. So what I do is I go in and I remove execute permissions from the downloads directory. So when I download something, I can never run it from there. I've either got to move it to a staging area, which has different permissions, or I don't know, yeah. Oh, another thing is I deny admins on the bottom there. I deny it, so admins can't run the browser, only regular users can. So you're never elevating and running the browser. You have to kind of forces you into using it. And some of the browsers don't really like that. There's a number of portable browsers where you can use them. You can run them low integrity. You can do a number of things that make it way more secure. But it's like with Chrome and the Firefox default installs, it's hard to do that. But you look at the permissions, you just tighten those up because that's your biggest entry point. Anti-execute, anti-elevation software. There are a number of things that will anti-exploit stuff. The anti-malware software that will detect any kind of memory, invalid memory writing, trying to access other processes, running processes when it shouldn't be running processes. NTLM, you want to disable so you're not sending out hashes out to the internet. You're not, so people can't do the relay stuff on you. You want to block that at the firewall. You want to block it on your system, and you want to block it on the outer firewall. You should remove the TLS cipher suites that you're not using, the ciphers that you're not using, or that you shouldn't be using. Because you shouldn't have RC4 on there. Microsoft's getting better about it, but they still leave stuff in there that you really can do without. And it's your own system. If it doesn't work, then put it back in. You should be able to go to, let's go on Wikipedia, the SSL page, the TLS page on Wikipedia is very much up to date on the latest the minimal acceptable settings. Okay, so open ports and services, I firewall. Now I use Windows Firewall, but I also have a second firewall, hardware firewall, because you can't trust Windows Firewall. Because seriously, I found out that Microsoft, well, first of all, you got like 300 rules in there. 300 rules! Come on. It's more fun when you do it on Twitter because you type really hard and do all caps and people, anyway. And there's just so many default rules. I kill all the default rules and start from scratch. And I found out that Windows will reinstall some of the rules when you do updates, and it will silently reinstall it. So you've got your firewall where rules are appearing without your permission that you never even knew about. So I have an extra firewall just to prevent that. And then there's this program I use called it's Benisoft Firewall Controller or something, where it allows you to set groups for all your firewall rules, and then say only these groups should be there. So if any other firewall rule is created that's not in that group, it'll delete them. So that kind of keeps track of that. And I also, on some of my systems, on servers and stuff, I use the PowerShell scripts to create the firewall rules, just delete everything that's there and then recreate them from scratch. That way I can carefully plan and reproduce what I'm blocking. stop services, obviously, remove protocols, things like net BIOS over TCP/IP, WINs, just things that you just don't need, and that are sending stuff out to the internet, but it's just basically just things that are leaking your credentials. Disable any kind of remote management. If you're managing the server, I mean, that's not always going to be possible, but if you're managing the server, then you should disable the remote management, disable WinRM, disable, there's a couple of scripts on Microsoft side one's called netcease and one's called SAMIR or something like that, that will disable some of the remote management features. You don't want people running PowerShell remotely on your system. And you can completely block those. I mean, you can block all the ports on the firewall, so nothing can come in. And telemetry, I already talked about that a little bit. You can remove the telemetry components. Now, it used to be with the older versions of Windows, you could delete stuff. When you first boot up Windows, you have the NT mode, where you have that's where check disk runs. And it's kind of before Windows loads. It's just a limited number of APIs that are available. But I had a tool that I made that would delete files there. So when Windows started, it wouldn't see the files there, and so it wouldn't try to replace the files. Now with Windows 10, it's way harder. You have to deal with kinds of stupid stuff to try to prevent Windows from putting files back. So that's why you don't put them in the first place. You remove them from the disk. COM and DCOM. I mean, I should not be saying this. Okay, I want to show you this little quote I found. What am I doing here? I've got a remote. Okay, so these are some of the things you should disable. The scripting object, the WScript, you have things like WScript run, scripting, you have the file system object, MSADO you most of the time don't need, CDO NTS most of the time you don't need. And then you can do things like, let's see, disable DCOM. Okay, I wrote this. This was in a book I wrote in 2002. So 15 years ago, I'm still giving the same exact advice, and it's still completely relevant. One of the other talks I attended yesterday was talking about exploiting every single one of these things. Come on. Okay, physical hardware security. One of the things I do is I block all the ports in my system. There's little locking things you can put in there. I mean, it's lock. It's you have to have a little key, but it's not like it's super secure, but it does prevent someone casually going up and sticking stuff in there. I also have like locking cables on my little firewall thing, so no one can stick in there. Protect the BIOS. Don't trust hardware. Like your phone, you shouldn't stick your phone. I mean, phone is like the worst thing you could possibly plug into your computer, connect to your computer, because this is something that's been on just about every network out there, and you don't. I mean, it's you're connecting untrustworthy hardware that's been on the outside, connect it to a sensitive computer, the most sensitive computer. What I do is, like, if you need to charge your phone on your laptop, what I do is use the little battery packs. I mean, you can buy data blocker cables, but you just get a little battery pack, portable battery pack. Plug your phone in there, and then we'll plug the battery pack into the laptop, and it keeps it from transferring any data, but it still charges. Let's see, BitLocker. If you're going to use, definitely use BitLocker. If you do use BitLocker, do the pre-authentication, the pre-boot authentication, where you enter in the password before the system boots up, because after it boots up, you're leaving too many artifacts, and you're leaving the keys where they can be stolen. Sticky keys, just another thing. I'm not going to go into that. Exploit mitigation. Some of the things you can do. I mean, if you do anything on your system, protect the LSAS process. And this is it's not set by default, but that one thing prevents Mimikatz from dumping all your SAM passwords. It prevents several things. It prevents Mimikatz from accessing the LSA process, and so it can't read any of the stuff that's stored in there. So that alone, if you do anything, run as PPL. And then you can also, there's our new audit settings, so you can keep track of that. File associations, that's a big thing that needs to be changed. Like, first of all, I removed JavaScript and VBScript because I don't ever use them on my system. But if I do, I just will enable them in my script itself. So yeah, that makes sense. I have a script that runs that enables it, and then yeah. So like JavaScript, like JS files should be associated with Notepad, and VBS files, and there's all the different, any kind of scripting file, in fact, should be associated with Notepad. Let's see, user account control. Now people say that user account control really isn't a security boundary. It's meant to be a tool to migrate from single user to having separate users, but a lot of what's happened is people think the user account control makes up for having separate users, but it doesn't. So what you do is you make sure, I still can't believe I'm saying this, but make sure you have an admin account and make sure you have a user account, but a lot of people still don't do that. Just that one thing there can make a huge difference because it prevents a lot of exploits from happening. There's so many UAC elevation exploits that you really can't prevent them from happening. There's just way too many, and they're constantly new ways to exploit that. So if you have a separate user account where you have to enter in the username and password, you completely eliminate that whole entire class of exploits. Mandatory technical, I'm not getting to that. One of the things you can do here, you can have, if you're running as two separate users, you can set this run as invoker flag for different specific processes, so you can run them non-elevated. So for example, you can run regedit without having to elevate to an admin or something else, or whatever user has the permissions. Another thing I do is when I need to run something sensitive, I don't elevate on that desktop. I do the fast user switching WinT and then log in as the admin user and run the stuff on that desktop, because then you have the complete isolation of the session and the Win station and desktop. You get all these different protections that will prevent anyone from exploiting that window that you have open. So if you have, like I showed you before, if you have a command prompt running as administrator and you have another process running as a regular user, if malware is able to send keys to the command prompt, then whatever it sends there is going to run as administrator. So just it's not that hard to. I mean, again, these are this isn't for regular users, but just never run stuff as administrator on your regular desktop. It's still running in the same session. It's still running on the same Win station and on the same desktop. So it's completely vulnerable to a number of attacks. So log out, or not log out, but just do a fast user switching. Monitoring, auditing. We're running out of time, so I'm not going to go in. You got to do a lot. Sysmon is the main tool to use here. For SIEM, you should have an external one, a remote one, and then you should have a local one. One thing I use is Event Sentry, which will, you can have it monitor any kind of change in the system, any kind of significant change in the system. And it's a free tool. Snort is what I use for IES. And there's tons of tools. I'm going to have a follow-up on this talk on that peer list page. I'll list all the different tools because there's just way too much to list here. But there's a number of tools you can use to just check your system, make sure you just do a sanity check, make sure everything's still clean. Here are some of the more common, some of my favorite tools. NoVirus thanks to tons of cool tools. They have one where everything that runs, you have to manually approve it, or you can whitelist some things, but you can whitelist anything, but I whitelist some things, and then that way every time something's running, I have to manually approve it running. Going back, I mentioned BSidesLV firewall control. I set that to notify me whenever something new is connecting out. So I have to manually approve every outgoing connection. Xqubits has some good memory stuff, memory detection stuff, where when one process tries to exploit another process, it can detect that. It can detect. There's tools to monitor registry changes. NoVirus thinks has similar tools. Xqubits has this one. There's a new feature coming out in the fall creators update where you can only run certain extensions with certain programs from certain locations. They have a tool that lets you enforce that on the system. That's it. So that's it. Anyone have a couple more hours? We can go the rest of it. But yes.
Can you tell us the name of your little hardware firewall? What do you like?
That's a MikroTik. I like this one because it's small. The question was what the name was of the firewall. And this is MikroTik, and I love it. And they have one that's even smaller than this, but it's got 2 Ethernet and wireless, but and it's $25. But and it runs off the USB power. So yeah, MikroTik.
Do you have a website?
Yeah, Zato.net. Xato.net.
So with this knowledge and the fact that you're using Microsoft Windows, do you consider yourself as a masochist?
Yes, very. Yeah. It's, anyone who knows me on Twitter probably gets so sick of hearing me rant. Why do you use Windows?
But on a more serious note, this secure kernel thing, is that a Windows 10 feature or
the secure mode?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is I believe it's the Fall Creators Update. One thing I forgot to mention that Edge, Microsoft Edge, actually has its own kernel that it runs in as well. It has its own. So I showed you the different kernels. Edge has its own kernel that it runs in, so it's actually pretty secure. I won't use Edge. I'll use Windows, but I won't use Edge. No, the reason I do Windows is because I've been doing Windows since Windows has been Windows. So it's been, I've used it every version of Windows ever, except for version 2. I use 1.1, but I use OS 2 also. But hey, old guy, do you use OS 2? Any other questions?
Do you have any experience with Bromium?
Yeah, Bromium, some of the new features that are coming out in the fall Creators Update, they actually take a lot of the features that Bromium uses, the microkernel, or not microkernel, it's like a miniature VM. They basically virtualize different processes. So they've used that, and they also, the Cubes OS, they take a number of the features of that. So Windows actually is becoming very secure, and within a couple of years, it's going to be a really incredible operating system, but there are still going to be bugs, and there's still old stuff that will never change. But yeah, they're making incredible strides, and it's really fascinating seeing where they're taking it. And it's like someone finally gave them permission to really change stuff. Like, let's change the kernel. Okay, cool. So it's kind of freed them up and completely changed the way the operating system works, and the ability to secure the operating system. You couldn't secure it before. Now you can. Kind of. Lots of pop-ups and lots of.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Anything else?
Next time, pick on another seal, will you please?
Okay, I'll do that.
I'll eat you a new asshole.
You will eat me one?
Give a big round of applause to Mark Burnett, everyone. Thank you.